And so the next speaker is Dr. Katerina Fotopoulou. So Katerina is PhD, psych, and is also a professor in psychodynamic neuroscience at University College London. Her lab focuses on topics and disorders that lie at the borders between neurology and psychology. Funded initially by a starting investigator grant, Body Itself, and more recently a consolidator grant, Metabody, from the European Research Council. Katerina has received several awards for her research, including the Distinguished Young Scientist Award by the World Economic Forum and the prestigious Yearly Career Award of the International Neuropsychology Society. She has more recently turned her attention to sustainability and what insight psychology and cognitive neuroscience can offer towards greater sustainable practices and less conspicuous consumption. So today she is going to talk about social touch as an effect regulator. So thank you, Katerina. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
But I can't share my PowerPoint. So when I try to do that, Teams gives me all sorts of other PowerPoints, but it doesn't give me access to my own desktop. Any ideas?
So you can share other content, but not your PowerPoint slides?
Has that worked?
Yep.
Okay.
It works.
Oh, great. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Great.
Right. So first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I think it's very kind of you to invite me, but also to invite all these amazing women we have heard today, and we will hear again tomorrow and later today. So thank you very much to Parma and all of you for hosting us, and also for being strong and sisterhood. And I believe touch and what is female are actually related. And the history of neuroscience and to some degree psychology has been dominated by the so-called male gaze. So that doesn't mean I have anything against men. I am actually not talking about women, but I'm talking about what it is to be male and what it is to be female, and what kind of science do we do. And I think touch is a lot about what it means to be female for both men and women. And everybody can still hear me, or am I talking to nobody? Because I can't see you anymore. Let's see if I can do. Can you see me now?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. So enough of that, and let's talk about touch. So what I'm going to do, because
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you switch on the presenter mode so we can see your slide in full screen?
I can't do that. That's what happened before, and it doesn't allow me to.
Okay, so it doesn't matter, don't worry.
Unless you want to give me some specific instruction. It seems to open both my app and the browser. I think that is the problem, and I'm hesitating to sort of try to fix it now. I don't know why. When you switch something, it switched on mine, and I don't seem to have control on that.
Okay, it doesn't matter. Don't worry, don't worry.
Yeah, but
There's no problem.
See the slides? Can you see the slides?
Yeah, of course.
All right. So and what I'm going to try to do with this talk on touch is not give you data, actually. I decided, because there's been so much data today, and I'm sure there'll be tomorrow, and some of the people that actually generate the data in my lab are speaking in this meeting. So I thought there's a lot of, which is great news, there's a lot of interesting touch in the last 10 years, much more than before. But we have lots of sort of different streams of research coming together, and I believe, at least for some aspects, we're lacking theoretical frameworks. So I'm going to focus on socio-effective touch, and I'm going to try to give you a framework, a theoretical framework for this that is a bit general, so bear with me. So every year, museums have to repair the damage caused to the various exhibits by thousands of visitors actually wanting to touch artifacts. Now, we can come quite close to an artifact in a museum, and we can see it, and we can explore it, can bang on the glass maybe and hear it, but why would we want to touch it? What is it that touch provides that vision does not? And by extension, what does physical contact add to our multisensory communications? So according to philosophers, what touch adds is a sense of reality. and makes us feel in contact with the external world. And people like Descartes, male philosopher, I may add, has understood that in a purely cognitive sense, and also in a sense of touch as the relationship between a human body and the physical world. And indeed, that sort of idea continues in studies of why we touch in museums and what contemporary philosophers have to say about touch as a fact-checking sense, as if you like a metacognitive sense. It gives us a sense of reality of our own thoughts and our own beliefs about the world. And indeed, some people in sales and marketing take advantage of that. So they encourage shops to put items where we can touch them. And they tell salesmen to actually offer clients something to touch because we are apparently more likely to buy it. But what about social touch? What about the more female, soft and woolly aspects of touch? Are they special for humans? And what is their role in cognition? And what I'm going to try to do in our framework today is argue that they are as special to us as at least nutrition and thermoregulation. And if we know anything with certainty in physiological sciences, is that if you do not feed a human being and if you do not thermoregulate yourself or others don't thermoregulate you, you die. So in that sense, in that very existential sense, touch is terribly important to us. And today I can't cover all of it, but I will cover quite a lot under the umbrella of affective regulation. And all of that I'm going to say is summarized in that paper we recently published with Mariana von Moor and Charlotte Krache in the special issue by Annette and Francis. So what is affect regulation? Well, humans have motivations, goals, desires, and embodied needs. And then there is reality. So sometimes the world allows us to fulfill these needs relatively straightforward.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again. We can see, we are still in slide 2. So probably, can you try to...
You haven't seen this or this?
Yeah. Now we are moving through the slide. Okay.
So, but that means you can't see the animations. This is, what are you seeing now, the presenter's mode?
Yep. Yeah, we are seeing basically, what do you
see now?
Yeah, in the PowerPoint presentation. So probably you have to remove the presenter mode and just show your slide in full screen.
Yes, I am doing, but it seems to be stopping every now and then. I honestly don't know
every time, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So can you see a purple circle?
Yep.
And now a red one?
Red, we see all the slides without the animation. So we see all this the circle in the slides.
And okay, I honestly don't know how to do that. So what do you think I can do in Teams? Because I can't see what you're seeing at all.
Yeah, of course. You can just move through the slide using the PowerPoint, and we see the PowerPoint window. So actually we see what you...
It doesn't seem so. Now
you're moving through your slides?
No, I'm just trying to figure out.
Just try to pass to the slide 6.
So can you see anything changing? I need a bit of... Right.
Can you try to share again? So do you...
Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Sometimes it's work. I don't know why, but you do things.
I honestly don't know. It's something that changed on your end just before I spoke. So camera off. You see me now?
Okay.
Yeah, now we see you.
Okay, good. And if I try to do...
share content, and maybe you can choose or your window or your screen. Probably your screen is better, so we can see your desktop, and what you see, we see the same.
It doesn't allow me to do it though. I'll try, but it sort of comes out, you know, the option.
Okay, that's perfect. Now we see your desktop. Quite unpolite, but okay. So now if you...
Okay.
That's good. Okay,
perfect.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right.
Yeah. We see everything.
We see everything in presentation mode, so
circle
perfect.
appear and disappear, the red one. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
That's all right. Great. I'm glad it worked now. So we have these goals, and then we have reality, sometimes allowing us to fulfill them and sometimes posing challenges, stressors, or even traumas. And what that does to a sentient human being, as well as in other mammals, presumably, big debate on this, is it generates negative and positive affective states. And I don't mean just emotions like anger, but I mean the more general concept of affect. So a valenced state and a corresponding approach and avoidant tendency. And the idea in cognitive sciences is that in order for us to achieve homeostasis, so achieve a balance between what we're trying to do within certain embodied constraints and what happens in reality, we need cognitive control. We need to be able, for example, to downregulate or control when and how much we feel certain affective states in order to either readjust our goals or try harder or do something else. So this is the definition of affect regulation cognitive sciences. And as you can see, these are typical long traditions about, for example, how we reappraise our affect or how we suppress them if it's the wrong time for it. And there is a long tradition in the field of studying basically a kind of trade-off between subcortical systems, say the amygdala, which tends to be activated when things are salient and negative, and the prefrontal cortex, and related physiological systems here, cortisol and various HPA kind of systems. So the idea here is that you have some old parts of the brain and they get activated with affect, and then you get the newer, more advanced, more cognitive prefrontal cortex that downregulates, suppresses emotions, or reinterprets it. And there is tons of studies on that, subcortical versus frontal. But all that sees the mind and the brain as though we were alone. Whereas there are many other traditions in both animal work and psychology saying that actually the way we regulate affect has a lot to do with our co-specifics. So in our case, with other humans. So how does social regulation of affect work? Social soothing is a classic example, where we all know and have experience, I hope, of being soothed by others. And that is important to human beings because, like with many other aspects of cooperation and affiliation, and I will talk about this quite a bit, we have learned that if we are doing things by ourselves, we can still do very well in a Descartesian sense. We can do very well in terms of being cognitively efficient, but we are not efficient in an embodied sense, in the sense that we may be taking up too much of these advanced brain resources and therefore exhausting our body. Anybody interested in that should read on allostatic load. But what I want to talk about is how usually we don't get allostatic load. And that's why, because we learn from early development that we have mothers and we have a supportive social environment that will sometimes also take care of our affect instead of us doing it all by ourselves. And indeed, there are a lot of traditions of that in science, from Harlow to modern views of seeing how touch, for example, may upregulate or downregulate affect and physiological regulation. But a problem is that these traditions are not always coming together. And they're certainly not coming together with what we know about cognitive or intrapersonal or individual affect regulation. And that is, I think, because in some of these traditions, it is understood that these kind of social regulation of affect runs deep. And what I mean by this is that it's not only higher order processes in the prefrontal cortex, but it's also many other aspects of lower cognition, as well as embodied processes. And for embodied, because people use this term as well to mean different things, here what I mean is social affective regulation that involves embodied interactions without necessarily explicit verbal or symbolic communications. And more broadly, just to be clear, because again, not everything that has the body is embodied. Embodied means that you do not think that everything happens in the brain, which a lot of people in cognitive science tend to focus on. It happens between the brain and the rest of the body and its environment. So with all this in mind, we have proposed for a number of years now a framework which we call mentalizing homeostasis, and other people have continued and done impactful work on this framework. And the main point for today is that our social brains and our affiliations are actually not independent, not divorced, not in a trade-off competitive relationship with the basic principle of our embodiment, and particularly homeostasis, and vice versa. Our embodiment is achieved, is co-regulated by the brain together with other people. So we're going to try to use this framework on our interest on socioeffective touch. And in order to do that, we need to understand a bit more these big terms such as homeostasis and allostasis, new buzzwords in the field that everybody uses, but again, not always with understanding, with sufficient understanding, and certainly not with sufficient agreement. So in a very formal way, you would say that physiological homeostasis is a model-free, i.e. just associative processes that hold constant a control variable despite ongoing internal and external perturbations by using afferent information to sense this deviation from a set point and then correct it, counter-regulation. So you first feel something and then you regulate. Whereas allostasis is more model-based. That means it requires more cognition. It's not just associations. And then you change the set point to start with. What does all this jargon mean? So very simply, the way I like to explain homeostasis is that organisms have a sustainability-like biological problem. So that simply means that we cannot survive beyond certain ranges. We need to keep our body within certain physiological ranges. For example, we cannot get too cold. So we have sentient systems that tell the organism at various levels, not just consciousness, how cold it is. And then we have some other systems that act to up or down regulate as needed to keep us within the range. That is classic homeostatic regulation. You're cold, you put on a coat. Allostatic regulation is a kind of trick we've developed, which says that if you always wait until you get cold when the weather changes to then put on your coat, you might get too cold too early and therefore die. So what you need to do is preempt that you might get cold during the day. So before you leave for the office, take the coat with you and have it ready as needed. So it relies on a certain degree of prediction to be able to plan and envision counterfactual states. That means states that haven't happened yet, and then be able to take preemptive action, do something in advance of the problem. That's simply what homeostasis and allostasis is. And to do that, in homeostasis, you need to have detection mechanisms so you can correct. And in allostasis, you need to have predictive capacity. So this is all great. Humans have been doing this for a long time. Physiologists agree we're both homeostatic and allostatically organized. But there is another problem. So we need a second trick. Allostasis, building all these predictive models, is energy hungry. The brain takes a lot of metabolic energy, and at the end of the day, homeostasis is a sustainability-like problem. So we can't be just, wasting our energy. So humans have a second trick up the sleeves to solve the sustainability problem, and that is they outsource or they extend some of their allostatic regulation to the environment. And we started back in the day with tools, and today we have smartphones and computers. And what they do, think of the weather, is they help us predict, think, remember. So we outsource some of the allostatic functions onto our physical environment, and particularly our technological developments. Important, though, we know for a long time in science that does not happen by single individuals. We do that first and foremost by affiliation and cooperation. So that our allostasis in humans, in our evolution, is largely a co-regulation with other co-specifics, with other people. So we are co-regulated by care in infancy and more broadly by culture. So if we look at an example in homeostasis, that's the idea of how do we regulate our eating. So if we take this idea that we have a constant, let's say that we need to keep our metabolism within a certain range, we have a drop in glucose just before we eat. Sometimes this is called the hungry feeling, you know, when you're and you want to eat a little bit. So the idea is that this drop prompts us to correct that homeostatically by eating. That would be a homeostatic interpretation of how we regulate. But actually, we've come to find out that that's only part of the story of how we eat. Another part of how we regulate our energy metabolism in terms of nutrition is seeing the allostatic side of it. And that is that the drop of glucose is not actually a corrective mechanism, but rather a preempting plan, an allostatic regulation. So the organism has learned that after we eat, there's going to be a massive increase of blood glucose, which may cause hyperglycemia. That can cause you to die. So what we have is other systems, allostatic systems, that kind of preempt more or less when we're going to eat during the day. And then we use insulin in this instance, but there's a cohort of other neuropeptides and hormones that comes into it that before we eat, in this case, down-regulates the glucose. So after we eat, we won't be overwhelmed by glucose. So from that point of view, the drop in glucose is not what motivates the eating. It's not a corrective mechanism. Instead, it's an allostatic regulatory mechanism. If we look at touch through this lens that I hope we now understand, we can start to understand also how social homeostasis and allostasis actually work in terms of touch. So we can see caregiving touch, for example. So somebody hugging an infant may actually be changing correctively a thing like the infant being cold or too warm or struggling to sweat. And similarly with feeding, we will be feeding an infant in response to our ideas about them being hungry. So we're co-regulating the body every time we provide caregiving touch in that homeostatic sense. But also, I will try to explain how we may be using touch, and particularly affective touch, and perhaps particularly CT optimal touch or other types of similar kind of touch to do allostatic regulation of an infant needs. So in this paper, we have argued that there are many ways in which to categorize and think of all the roles of touch in homeostatic and allostatic regulation. But I think first in homeostasis, it's important to separate between two major homeostatic roles of touch: attachment and caregiving, as I explained. So both, of course, serve homeostasis, right? They keep us alive within that physiological range. But we have learned from many studies in the field that actually in humans, like in some other mammals, it seems that we have developed in our evolution a unique motive for social proximity and contact comfort, as Harlow called it. So when we are close, I mean, the attachment field is enormous, right? And it's been going on for 30 years at least. But there's a lot of work on that in animals as well. And it shows that when we are close and in tactile interaction with caregivers, in most mammals, we have an increase in positive affect. Versus when we are separated and there is no tactile interaction, we have increases in negative affect. And there's a lot of work on the corresponding physiological mechanisms for seeking, approaching caregiving figures and enjoying these interactions, and vice versa, what happens when we cry, when we have separation anxiety. So from the point of view of our framework, and there's quite a lot of nice philosophical work by Anna Chaunica on this, maternal contact and early touch with caregivers in infancy may constitute a first prior. And in this paper, Anna, colleagues, and I talk about also being in the womb, but we all that extend to early infancy, so that we may have a kind of evolutionary prescribed prediction for contact comfort, social proximity, and we heard beautiful work by Francesca on the peripersonal space and how we may be ready for social proximity already in infancy and social attachment. Thus, the presence of these things, from our point of view, what do they do to cognition, is its job primarily at that attachment area is to regulate affect. So if you have variation in this postnatal skin-to-skin touch, for example, we know that things happen physiologically. If you are lacking touch, you will have increased fear, increased sensitivity to pain, increased stress reactivity. These are review papers, but there's wonderful work at the genetic and epigenetic level by Michael Meany and other people around the world. So in this literature, contact comfort mechanisms, when we are thinking in the attachment setting in humans, are typically understood as serving to increase the infant's engagement with their caregiver. They're seen by Cohen and colleagues as a baseline condition for humans. We expect to have others there, particularly early on in life. And ultimately, this is seen as promoting social attachment as a kind of safe place for cognitive, affective, and physical development. And lifelong, there's lots of studies in marriage and the presence of others during our lifetime that shows that indeed when we have supporting others around us, we fare better both physically and psychologically. So attachment is given here as the primary important aspect of that drive. And we think this is true, but touch, socioeffective touch, doesn't only do attachment in infancy. As I've been saying, it also directly is implicated in physiological regulation, not only to keep the other close to you, but to make sure what the other does has implications for your own survival. And this is the initial mentalizing homeostasis idea. This is very, very simple. It basically says that an infant, because of motor immaturity, cannot regulate their interoception. So when a parent, for example, feeds or holds or hugs an infant, they're not just maintaining attachment and informing the infant that there is social presence there. Important as this may be, they're also simultaneously, so socialization and embodiment served simultaneously. The parent is actively modulating the infant's physiological states, therefore her internal states, her interoceptive states, and we know that these relate to affect. And this is, again, because human infants, more than any other, even other mammals, any other species in this world, have the most prolonged motor immaturity. So they cannot take care of the body by themselves, so they cannot change their interoceptive states by themselves, they cannot feed themselves, they cannot thermoregulate. So if we, as co-specifics, don't do that for them, if there isn't a mother, a father, or the caregiver there, they will die, they will not have physiological regulation, they will not have what we expect in evolution a person to have in order to learn their own affective regulation. Example, just to make this a bit more concrete, thermoregulation. So how does it work? There are many complex mechanisms of thermoregulation, but some classic things is that you get signals from thermoreceptors, reach the hypothalamus, and then you might get something like norepinephrine trying to trigger this non-shivering thermogenesis. So you basically get warm in your body, or you break down fat in certain tissues so that you get this warmth metabolically. So this is classic mechanisms in human adults. Now newborns can't do that. They have some of the machinery to do that, but they're missing some critical elements of it. So they don't have enough fat, and they may not have some of the important enzymes that facilitate this process. So literally they cannot thermoregulate with the same mechanism. So physiologists have been studying this in other mammals as well as in infants, and they say, well, how do they do it? And it turns out they cry. This is what they do. So when certain remember, homeostasis center indices fall beyond, let's say they get cold, they fall below the range of homeostatic thermoregulatory safety, a crying response is elicited. So the adult will hopefully understand and be emotionally responsive, will provide some response, bodily interaction, thermoregulation. And that's how the infant will learn via crying, via the other, to regulate their own states. And beyond thermoregulation, more generally, others regulate our embodied feelings constantly in infancy, so that what they do and how the two bodies even synchronize are closely related. And there's quite a lot of work on that. And this synchrony between the bodies and between behavior and physiology depends on a parent who either by constitution or by environment is able to respond effectively at contingency, or depending who you read, in attunement to the infant. And this things together determined how infants will learn to regulate their own bodies and their own emotions. Also, parents transfer their own bodily and affective regulation to children. Even for some of you attending here have done very nice work. But what happens when an infant lies on our chest, the heartbeat of the parent is tuned into the heartbeat of the child and vice versa. Importantly, though, we are not synchronous forever. Progressively, in infancy and more in childhood and more in adulthood, we need asynchrony, as it were, as much as we need synchrony. So we need to also sometimes delay the infant until it can be fed, or tickle him, entertain them, change their salience, encourage them to try new things and not being overwhelmed by the constraints of homeostasis. And so that brings us to allostatic role of touch, i.e. teaching a child to anticipate things. There's a reason why we all say, you have to structure a kid. They need to have structured times for eating and all that, because that helps allostatic regulation. And in terms of social touch, our focus today, we have proposed that there are certain ways to touch infants, such as stroke them, in CT-optimal or not ways. But the important thing is that you can have the same touch doing homeostatic things and allostatic things. But what we mean is, how do you do these allostatic things? So an example is stroking and tickling have been known to have communicating roles. So they're saying something during a social interaction. And Louise Kearse in her lab has shown, particularly for CT-optimal touch, that continues throughout the lifespan. So even if you have, remember, no explicit, no verbal, no symbolic communication, you still get, with some consistency, meanings out of CT-optimal touch. So in infancy, the primary role of these communications may not be to simply correct something homeostatically, but rather to change what the child anticipates or how the child deals with anticipation itself, such as, for example, to delay or change a variable set point. For example, a father may tickle an infant to keep them awake a bit longer, not to let the infant fall asleep, to better regulate their circle around the mother's availability for food or the family structure around their needs. And there is beautiful work from this lab. There's a series of work. This is one of the recent papers, that stroking an infant can act as an embodied ostensive cue, directing attention, salience, epistemic gains. Simply, that means that salience is how much we notice something in contrast to its environment. So we can sometimes, parents use touch to change this balance, to say to the infants what is important for their learning, what they need to pay attention to, as opposed to what can be left in the background. So if touch has this unique ability to direct our attention, to guide our salience, this might be one of the ways by which a parent teaches allostasis to the infants. This you need to learn to predict. This you don't need to worry about. And work we've been doing with Charlotte for years and Mariana more recently has shown that similar things applies in adults, so that the social present and the attachment style of an adult seems to predict how they will respond to pain, particularly the salience aspect of nociceptive intervention. And we think also this may have to do something with pathways like oxytocin and other such allostatic pathways in the brain. So not doing the details here because this is the broad framework. So this perspective on social affect regulation kind of unifies long-studied insight from both animal and human studies regarding the importance, role of touch and social support more generally in social bonding, as well as in physiological regulation. And what I didn't cover as the previous talks is how that relates to multisensory integration and also psychopathology. But Laura is speaking about this, I think, and if you want to see more, you can see her work and Paul's work. And some of you know, we've done quite a lot of work, predominantly with Louise Kearse and Mariana von Moor, but also with another big data set on similar lessons during COVID. So I think Louise is talking about this in this meeting. And we have some very excited new stuff on allostasis that it's almost ready. And when it's ready, I could presented to you next time, and that has to do with what I called about asynchrony, the self-other distinction, and the role of egocentricity and allocentricity in allostatic regulation. And thank you, of course, to all our funders, all the wonderful researchers I feel very privileged to have worked with over the years who do really the work, and you all for your attention.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you so much. It was a brilliant talk. You cover so many topics so relevant today. So let's open up the floor for questions. We have one from Francis McLone. He asked, do you think that by outsourcing the technology, our basic survival needs, we are compromising our highly evolved protective system, a case of learned helplessness? We became more vulnerable. So he questioned the fact that we are, in a way, devoting to technology, our allostasis and homeostasis.
That is the whole thesis of extension. Think of Anti-Clark and many other philosophers written about this, sort of not just the embodied but the extended mind, has frequently been by various people seen as a negative versus a positive things, right? Is technology taking something away from evolution, as Francis says, or is it actually adding and all exciting and all this? And I'm somewhere in between. It depends. So think of most of our extensions, our digital tools, for example, are hard, and they are, think of your laptop or your computer, it always has angles, and, think of what we say in science about how we penetrate things, and, all these male engineering fantasies about our technology tend to, yes, Francis, alienate us for our softness, our willingness, our need for soothing, our need for co-specifics, our dependency to each other, as we learned during COVID. But that doesn't stop us, particularly if wonderful women like you organize events like that, to try to equip our technological smart devices with these kind of evolutionary learned the value of softness, willingness, proximity, contact, comfort. And indeed, there's many people now developing soft robotics. A lot of you know about this. We have something in the lab. There's a paper out already, and there'll be more coming out with Mariana Moore and other people, where we look, and Agisti Saramandi, our newest PhD student, where we look at how we can have city-optimal text, for example, or other types of socioeffective touch in human-computer and human-robot interactions.
Thank you, Catherine. Dr. Gallese asked if you can tell us more about the data about the pandemic, but we know that in a bit, Louise Kirsch is giving her talk about that. So sorry, Vittorio, but we have to skip your question. And Francesca Garbarini, she has asked, thank you, Kat, for this very nice talk. How do you think that this social side of touch that you nicely discussed relates to developmental disorder, so like autism spectrum disorder?
Yeah, there is some wonderful work by others on this, on autism. So Sarah, who spoke today, covers interoception more broadly. Cascio and others have looked at socioeffective touch and city-optimal touch, Francis as well, and development. So, I mean, it is $1 million question, and we don't have all the answers yet. But based on this framework, I would argue two things. First, I think it's unlikely that a problem of touch in development in any given dyad will be alone. It's more likely going to be a multisensory problem, both for environmental and for possibly genetic reasons. So it could be that the infant, for reasons of their own, have a different sensitivity or a different problem around sensation as a whole, or around interoceptive sensations, including socioeffective touch, or it could be that the environment, it doesn't do the right kind of responding. But it's unlikely that touch will be alone. Usually deprivation comes in bigger buckets, unfortunately. But of course, within this bucket, I think touch is terribly important for all the reasons I said. And we have done a lot of work, at the very least in the lab, to look at two things. A, how affective regulation will be influenced. So it's a mess if you don't get it regulated early. And as a psychotherapist also, I work with patients who are frequently very able people, fantastically successful in what they do, but they have tons of somatic issues because they've learned to self-regulate all their lives, and they're finding it very difficult to accept help and support. So that's one negative outcome that we see. So it's not quite a neurodevelopmental disorder, but it's a sort of hidden functional bodily disorder. And then the other thing is that cognitively, I didn't have a lot of space to cover this because it's a little bit more complex, so I'm hesitating. But our framework, if you want to read the paper, doesn't stop where I stop. We argue that embodiment socialization, this synchronicity, goes all the way to metacognition. So we have different metacognitive allostatic way of constantly regulating ourselves. So I would argue that we can see some of these early interoceptive deficits to correlate with higher order cognitive dysfunctions as well, which may explain some of the things we see in autism and schizophrenia.
Yeah, thank you. We have the last question. Dr. Umilta asks, what about the effect of touching the infants on the caregivers? So do also the caregivers have any positive feedback, for example, establishing a stronger relation with the infant? Do you check that?
So yes, it's a beautiful question and we really, really love it. So a lot of people have done work on that before us, and indeed it makes a tremendous difference for the caregiver as well. It regulates their states. For mothers particularly, the mother's body from pregnancy to the infancy period of the infant is completely changed in order to adjust to that. And frequently it also has a lot to do with their upbringing and their infancy. But beyond this, some things we have done is, first of all, the social softness illusion. So other talks today talked about self-touch. So we've shown that when you do self-touch in CT optimal areas versus perhaps less innervated by CTs areas of the body, then we see that we get pleasure in an almost illusory way. So the way we've understood that is that we have learned to anticipate pleasure by touching others, which may explain some of the allogrooming findings, like we do more allogrooming than needed for hygiene purposes, as Dunbar taught us. So we think that giving pleasure has become receiving pleasure for humankind. This is, we think, a top-down rather than a bottom-up effect, but it waits to be seen. And there's beautiful studies on the other point made in the question, which is that yes, the parents' ability to regulate the infant is positively reinforced by the infant responses, serves the literature, which together these two things lead to a greater bond between infant and parent, which then in itself is associated with better both affective regulation and cognitive outcomes in the infant.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katerina, for your talk and this inspiring discussion. Thank you again. Now we move to our